Doesn't anybody want to work anymore? I came across a great video. Michael Bordenero actually put a video out of very similar content, and it inspired me to talk about this very fact, because in Canada, I heard the latest results are the unemployment rate is about 6.8% in Canada right now. As well as there's places like Ontario that are closer to 7.5%. And I heard even Calgary is in and around that 8 to 9% unemployment rate. I never thought we'd be in a place like this, in a country like this, where we're talking about getting very, very close to 1 in 10 people not employed. People that are employable, but they're not working. And there's probably a whole pile of different reasons why that is. But I want to break this down because, a lot of people wonder, why don't you get back to work? You know what? I'm only 54, and the conversation about, me getting canned or retired, and then basically said, sayonara. Well, you can get back on the saddle and work. Well, the fact remains is I'm not working for a corporation, a decision I made many moons ago, and right after that date, I pretty much put the feather in my cap. I decided I want to exercise other opportunities, which is what I'm doing right now. But it goes beyond that. There's a whole pile of different people and different perspectives and attitudes now that are changing this overall, necessity to work or want to work or desire to work. I think about this very, very long time ago. I used to share stories with one of my grandmothers. She was German, and unfortunately had to navigate through some of the war. There was war, and she told me a story of a situation where how she all started was she was in Germany during the war. Soldiers came in the middle of the night in her pajamas, nightgown, chased her and her family out of the house. And it was a very, very tragic moment for her. And this really resonated with me. But more fast forward, because what ended up happening was she ended up okay, everything is settled out. But what ended up happening was she decided to move to Canada. But here, landed immigrant as a Canadian, she struggled to find employment. But she worked extremely hard. My grandmother was one of the hardest working people, even right up to the point where, she started to get a little bit of dementia and then eventually had to go into a home. But before that, leading up to that, she lived on her own. She had a farm, a house in the city, and managed large gardens, as well as just cooked and just constantly on the go. She was one of these people that knew what it meant to work physically hard, emotionally, mentally, every aspect of the work environment. She managed and worked her way through it, because when she landed in Canada, she didn't speak the language. She had to figure out, how am I going to navigate? How am I going to survive here? So she started out using some of her talents. She was amazing at baking, amazing cook. So she started making pies, selling pies in town, and of course making some money that way. Then she got onto a farm as a farmhand. So she was just basically doing hard physical work every day. You're dealing with cattle, pigs, horses. You're dealing with the plows and the fields, and dealing with all the other farm work that went on. And all of this with the little lady. She was small. She was probably barely pushing 5 feet at her peak. And she had a small lady with a big heart, is what I'll say. And God rest her soul, she was absolutely amazing. And we would visit her every single summer. And she was one of these people that was constantly, she knew when to relax. She knew when to have that glass of wine, watch some news, play some board games with us. But she also knew that when there was work to do, she just went and did it. There was no complaining. It wasn't a matter of, maybe they should do it, and passing off the buck, passing off the accountability, which unfortunately now feels very much like the world. CYA, passing off the buck, giving that task to somebody else, because that's not my job. That's not in my job description. That's not, you know what? Back in the day, you just did what you had to do. And so now we're in an environment where there's all kinds of different perspectives on that. You have people, of course, naturally, a lot of people that don't necessarily want to do any more or less, necessarily than their job entails. Now, unfortunately, this kind of takes me to where I was at in my corporate gig. And, you start to get trained that follow your swim lanes. They use terminology like use your swim lanes. Okay, well, that's all well and good. But using our swim lanes meant that often, you started to develop this attitude and perspective of, this is my job. That's their job. They got to do that. there's people for each particular job, and they start to ingrain this. And this feels like a very much a cultural indoctrination, if you will, but particularly when you're in the corporate world, and you learn very quickly that you're very accountable to your own job. So therefore, you don't want to start stepping out of your swim lane. And unfortunately, that usually means you develop this attitude and this perspective of, that's not my job. But you know what? The corporate game taught me a lot of things. And it's not always necessarily about, wanting to work and do other things, outside of your purview per se. And, the reality is what we're seeing now is a different group of people. I mean, we still have some of those people, like I spoke of, some of my grandparents, a lot of them grew up on the farms, and they know what it's like to work extremely hard. They know what hard work is, blood, sweat, and tears. They literally coined those phrases. And a lot of those personalities really know what it means to work very, very hard and are willing to work at all costs, because it's not just about earning a buck. It really is, in fact, about survival. You see, and now you have this other Generation X, where, folks like us who are kind of infringing on that 60 and younger, we kind of get the idea of what it means to work, but we sort of also had to adapt to technology and some changes. And of course, the corporate life, which I spoke of, where you learn your swim lanes. And so people start to learn that, that's my job, that's your job, and I'm not going to step outside and do any more than that. Okay? But we still had a little bit of that, that boomer and beyond, the silent generation, where, they still had that, didn't matter at all costs. We just got to head down and everything and go to town. But you see, things have been changing. Then along comes Generation X, like us, and you start thinking, okay, we just gotta, we kind of have a lot of that spin-off of those generations before us, where it meant all about just working as hard as physically possible and lock and load. But then, we also learned that we had to move on and adapt and do different things. And then, of course, millennials come along, and millennials kind of have another perspective of, well, wait a minute. We saw what they're doing, and I'm not sure the benefit, the juice is worth the squeeze. So then we're starting to see this next generation of, the tail end of the millennials rolling into what we see as potentially getting into a world of now Gen Zs and beyond, where there's this perspective of, working smarter is better than working harder. And so it's not that I want to be there first thing in the morning. I should be able to roll in at 10, 11. I should be able to work from home. And a lot of these different shifts in working, it's always debatable about whether they're functional or not, but it does represent an overall shift in work ethic, work perspective, being practical, giving people the work-life balance that some people want. And then others just take it to the whole nother level. And we're seeing those people that often, playing their video games in their parents' basement. And a lot of those folks are doing it simply because they can. And, we have a generation now where the parents are just willing to, as long as the kids are safe, warm, comfortable, the parents are often willing to take up a lot of the slack. And so I've seen this in my world, where a lot of the younger generation, while many of them are absolutely ready to fire it up to work, I know my kids have been looking for work and they've been struggling, trying to find jobs, put in resumes, do it both digitally as well and in person. And there's been some struggles, if we're being honest. Although that being said, they all eventually found work. It feels like there's this discrepancy between, are there enough jobs versus, we're dealing with the conversation of not being able to find a job. When they're talking about 7 or 8% unemployment rate, what does that mean when you're knocking on doors and nobody's hiring? A lot of this has to do with the type of work it is. I think about many moons ago, we did jobs that were not necessarily the most, how do I say this? the ideal jobs, I guess, in our mind, right? We always have these thoughts of, yeah, I'd like a job that gives me this, all these levels of satisfaction. And unless it checks all the boxes, that's not really the job for me. I mean, I know people that operate the honey wagon. What's the honey wagon? Well, for those that know, and others that don't, they're the ones that, operate those suck trucks that clean out those portable outhouses. And it may not be glamorous, but some of those jobs don't pay too bad. But there's a lot of people that won't even come near those types of jobs. But you know what? I've worked many moons ago, years ago, when I first started my career, many years ago. I started, when I was in the field and I wanted to do a little bit of that construction work I mentioned early on. And I better pull this up. This is getting cold out here. My ears are getting cold. It's about minus 20 again. Here we are. You know what? It's just, we're definitely in a winter here. As opposed to Michael there. Shout out. He's obviously doing his walk and talks from a much more agreeable destination. I'd like to maybe move down there one day. Walking by the waterfront and looking at the green trees. It looks great. But you know what? I've worked, back when I started in, kind of started working a trade. And, the first thing foreman said to me was, here's a shovel. There's a ditch we need to dig 4 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and about 100 feet long. Okay. So that was my first exposure to being in an electrical trade. And yet I'm thinking, why am I operating a shovel if I'm supposed to be doing electrical work? That's because sometimes there's just dirty work that has to get done. And it's just peculiar. I mean, I see it all the time. I see all kinds of ads for these kind of jobs that not everybody wants. Not everybody wants those, knuckle busters, blood, sweat, and tear kind of jobs like my grandmother did. Times are changing. Maybe we don't need to do all that type of work anymore. But there's still a required effort that has to go out there. There's still those types of tasks that have to get completed. And many years ago, I built a house, my second house. I was physically building it. And I took kind of the attitude about it that, there was a lot of things to do, whether it was plumbing, electrical, flooring, finishing, you name it. I did it all. But I also did cleanup, threw out the garbage, hauled the things to the dump, loaded vehicles, loaded materials. I did everything that had to be done. Why? Because it has to get done. There's sometimes those decisions that you just have to make. It's time to step up. It's just time to do the work. And that's the problem. These days, there's a lot of those dirty jobs, those jobs that not everybody wants to get their hands into, but quite often they're out there, they're available, and they're opportunistic, but not a lot of people want them. It's not the kind of work that they signed up for. And so unfortunately, this whole role in social media continues to play this whole effect on a lot of the younger up and comers. And a lot of people, I do know a lot of young workers that just want to get to it, get to work, figure it out, work hard, earn a dollar. But unfortunately, what we're seeing now is an economy with increased taxation. And of course, we're talking about people getting dissuaded. They're actually getting turned right off by the fact that it's almost impossible to get ahead, or there's this feeling of disparity. There's this feeling of, just not being able to make enough money. You hear it all the time, and people thinking no matter how hard I work, even when I work overtime, the sliding tax scale just takes even more off the bottom line. And a lot of people, even if they do want to work, they are starting to recognize that what's the point? What is the point of all of this when the more you make, the more they take, right? I mean, that's a conversation that we've had quite often. And I hate to talk about this in such a negative light, but that is a reality. Now, with that said, it's also kind of like I was saying, trades, people going into the trades are less and less. There's a great opportunity to make a ton of money because Now where less and less people are interested in getting into the trades, see, that's part of the issue here. So there's a lot of these potential job opportunities that people are no longer interested in. A lot of social media is playing a part in this role. A lot of people are seeing, hey, all over social media, hey, how I made my first $1 million. Hey, I make $10,000 a month. Hey, I do all these things. All these social media, they deliver high, or they promise high and they deliver low. And there's a lot of this, hey, sign up to my book, sign up to my online courses, and you'll make $1 million. You know what? A lot of these false promises, people go out and do it, spend some money, and they become grossly disappointed when things just don't work out. And that's just one of the other, disappointing aspects. Everybody wants the get rich quick scheme, and they don't necessarily want to get her done. Now, I know a lot of people that do want to go to work, and then some of them do get work. Some of them are happily engaged. They're working, they're doing their thing, they've found their perfect career, and they're working. But there's others that just can't, and these struggles are real. And realistically, I mean, we're seeing in the United States, a lot of the statistics over there, although unemployment rates are still significant, they're lower and they seem to be dropping. Canada, unemployment rates are higher. And that's of people that are recorded that are good to work. They qualify to work, not retirees. In a case like mine, I've decided that, combination of I didn't want to get ruined by corporate, which was trying to, basically mess with me constantly. I felt like I was in a really, really bad headspace. And a lot of people are recognizing the corporate game is expanding. What we're seeing is the fact that CEOs are taking a bigger piece of the pie. They're in it for themselves. And a lot of people are just getting absolutely disappointed with the very concept. Can't get up the ladder, can't climb. And all they see is this ever increasing demand on the workers. In the meantime, the CEOs keep drawing in the money. The shareholders, the top players are all getting the majority of the cash in these corporations. And a lot of people just feel like, what's the point? But the bottom line is it's not to be so disappointed. I mean, the bottom line is we all have to start somewhere. And this is why I started my whole story with my grandmother. I mean, it's not easy. And sometimes you've got to claw your way to the top. Sometimes you just got to bust your hump. Sometimes you got to hurt yourself. Your knuckles are scraping. I'm not saying we should, bleed for a company. That's the last thing I say these days, especially with corporations. Small businesses often represent, a better opportunity in that they appreciate their workers quite often a lot more. You have better opportunity to move up. And honestly, trades are a good place. But the fact that qualified people for work, that number is growing that are not that are not employed currently. And we're seeing this. And realistically, like I've said before this, and I've talked about this in previous videos, sure, probably a couple months ago now. It's been a while. I mean, there was no snow on the ground. But I basically said I doubled down. I busted my hump early in life so that later in life, things would be easy. And that's all we got to start thinking about in that perspective. It's sort of survival instinct. We need to have a bit of a survival instinct. And while these jobs are not perfect and it doesn't check all the boxes, sometimes we just got to get her done, so to speak, and go out there, work double time, work hard, be smarter. And that's why now I'm not working corporate game. I'm doing my own thing, my side hustle. The bottom line is work harder when you're younger, because as you get older, your enthusiasm for hard work, your enthusiasm for putting up with toxic bosses goes down. Your enthusiasm for coworkers who don't pull their weight goes down. Your enthusiasm for working in general might drop a little bit. So work harder when you can. You've got to get a good start. You've got to get a good go at this. But realistically, what we're seeing today is specifically in Canada and in a lot of places where we're seeing strong competition for those jobs. It just means it's harder and harder to get a job. But then how do you argue with that when they say unemployment rate is up? Well, there are jobs, but there's a lot more competition. That's really what it boils down to. Way more people out there battling for the same jobs, and they may not be the ideal job. It may not be the job you want ultimately, and it may not even be your end job, but it might be something you get started with. Unemployment rate, very interesting conversation. Anyway, I'd like to hear your thoughts, everybody. Please do drop a line, and as well, shout out Michael Bordendino. Thanks again. Hey, for the inspiration. Talk to each and every one of you real soon. Bye-bye.